Joining us now is journalist and law student at Yale Law School, Omer Aziz. Omer, how are you?
I'm doing well, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm really glad to be speaking with you. And we're going to open this conversation up because these Sam Harris conversations, or as we call them on this show, he who shall not be named, really have bigger and broader public implications than just the sort of eccentricities of one kind of figure and his sort of culty followers. So we'll get there, but let's sort of work this backwards. You wrote an article a couple of months ago. I actually had you on this program after the article came out. It was a very thorough critique of Sam Harris, and not just him, but the sort of broader collapse of public intellectualism that he represented. You talked a lot about history. You created a lot of context, or as some might call it, you were a member of the regressive left and taking him out of context and avoiding the real issues, which I guess would be the other way of spinning it. Now, Sam Harris invited you on his podcast, Waking Up, for a debate.
Yeah.
Why don't you take us from there? Because this episode is one of the most bizarre, deranged things I've ever heard.
Yeah. So after he saw that he could not ignore the article because people were sharing it and they knew it was a serious work and you can't just dismiss it as a lie or as dishonest, which is what he likes to do, he publicly invites me on Twitter to his podcast, right? Now, this is not how most people are invited to shows. He could have emailed me. He could have DM'd me. Clearly, he wanted to send his followers a message and show them how brave he was. And he probably thought, honestly, that I would say no because he hadn't heard of me. I gladly accepted. And then we went back and forth over email on how this was going to be structured. And, naive old me, I guess I come from another generation, even though I'm 20 years younger than him, where people sit down and have honest intellectual debates and discussions, no strings attached, no holds barred, right? Mm-hmm. And yet he wanted to structure this conversation as me reading my article to him so that he could respond. Like, it was literally the most creepy and bizarre and strange thing to do, right? It was like, not even. If a professor of mine asked me to do that, I would tell him to buzz off. Like, who the hell do you think you are?
That sounds like something from like the Ike and Tina Turner movie almost. Like, it's the only thing that I could think of. It just sounds like it's just creepy and weird.
Yeah, literally any other way to structure this conversation. And I challenge anyone to name me a journalist or an anchor or an intellectual or writer who would dare to do something like that, right?
Well, I'm going to start next week. It sounds pretty fun.
Yeah. Every single person should read their critiques word for word.
Yes.
But, I understood how these guys operate, and that had I said no, he would have said publicly that, look, here is a critic who challenged him in print and is not, is sort of ducking or dodging debate. I knew that's what he would have said. And look, you can say anything about me, but that's one thing I won't accept, that I'm ducking the debate.
Sure.
And so I went on and I did that, and it did feel really strange and weird to read it to him and to hear him respond. But
it's just so weird, man. Okay.
Yeah, I know, but thankfully we did move away from just reading the text and being able to go back and forth over some of these issues. But yeah, the best parts of the conversation with him were when we were not engaged in me reading the text. But again, it's really weird because whenever the conversation is moving in an interesting direction, he can say, and he did say this multiple times, well, get back to the text. Why don't we, let's do this systematically. We can talk about that later. Get back to the text.
Right.
Right. And so that to me is like, it's such a sideshow, like how someone can be so unself-aware to try and structure a conversation like that and not think that it makes them look bad. What happened to commitments to truth and to honest discourse, right? And then this guy is calling everyone else a liar and dishonest. It just boggles the mind, the level of unself-awareness that someone like that has.
Yeah, so moving from there, to be blunt with you, I listened to about half of it. I couldn't take it anymore at a certain point, to be really transparent. But it seemed like, and this is what's interesting to me. There's a substantive point, and then there's what only could be called really just an emotional point, which I think actually might lead us to some places that are kind of awkward to talk about in a public forum. But I think that they might be getting us somewhere in terms of kind of understanding Sam Harris and this sort of kind of odd movement around him. When you sort of got to the merits of the issues, what's very interesting about this whole exercise is that since Sam Harris has begun his collaboration with Maajid Nawaz, whose book they put out together was the sort of launching point for your initial critique, Sam Harris did something where he kind of actually he conceded some really fundamental ground, because he kind of came to prominence with this sort of, first it was this sort of I'm the unapologetic atheist, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, the intellectual version of like Frank Gaffney or something, which is that there's something just really wrong with Islam, and it's fundamental and you can't change it, and nothing, and it cannot. Change cannot come from the inside. Change will come either from fighter jets and my columns, and that's the only way. With his collaboration with Maajid Nawaz, it's really interesting because Maajid Nawaz, who is another character who you can, I want to hear your thoughts on, but Maajid Nawaz, for all of his sort of embrace of this kind of role of, talking about Islamic terrorism, which sometimes he's right on, sometimes he's wrong on, I think from a policy perspective, he has acknowledged and argues that you can reform Islam from within the sources of the tradition. And Sam Harris, according to that book, which I have read, and their talks, he's kind of reluctantly gone along with him, which is interesting because substantively that was the big argument that people like you and I think had with Harris, at least philosophically. And then, of course, getting into the policy and everything, he's a disaster. But so what the debate seemed to take place on was on this sort of emotional grounds that Sam Harris is personally deeply aggrieved and upset that he has been, deemed a supporter of torture or deemed a bigot. And that at this point, it's sort of his own kind of emotional umbrage, which frankly seems to me like that's where this whole project came from, his own sort of emotional infrastructure around these issues.
Yeah, I mean, he seems surprised by the fact that you can make controversial arguments and not create controversy. Like he couches his words in very controversial ways, and you're right. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the substance any day of the week. And again, in the second article that I wrote, I gave him an open-ended invitation to debate and discuss these issues, which I know he'll never take up because we're on equal footing with the moderator. I'm not reading my damn text to him, on his podcast with equal rules. It's very different. But the worst part about the podcast was this like fixation on his motivations, right? He was trying to convince me of his noble motives.
Right.
Well, look, there's two ways to know someone's motives, right? I mean, essentially you can't know someone's motives. Either you can take their word for it, and that's not a standard that I'm going to apply to myself. Otherwise, I would take every public person's word for it when they said that they were doing things for noble reasons, including politicians, right? Imagine that world where we just listen to everything everyone says.
I'm sure he meant it for the best.
Their own.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or you could infer motives and intentions and a general vision from action, right? Like you called his book a book. I mean, it was actually an email exchange that was supposed to be a blog post that was published as a book. And in that book, there is nothing original or new that is argued. And it's something like 120 pages. And so from that, and by the way, Harris has made no serious study of Islam. It doesn't seem like he's even tried to talk to experts about it. It doesn't seem like he's visited any Muslim countries. It doesn't seem like he knows many Muslims. So from all of these facts, I inferred that, okay, he's an ideologue who uses Islam as his platform and to create controversy, right? He wouldn't be invited on Bill Maher's show or, which I think got something like 3 million views or all this sort of attention without the comments that he's made about Islam, which are actually inaccurate and just bloated and inflated in terms of the threat that they perceive. But again, on the substance, you're right. Or actually not on the substance. a huge part of the podcast is devoted to what other people have said about him, right? Murtaza Hussain said this, and such person said this, and some Muslim on Twitter said this, right? I mean, it was just so bizarre. And to ask me my reactions to these people, it was really strange. And I don't know any other public intellectual or journalist really who is in the public sphere and whines about the controversy that they receive. So, I mean, on that point, but again, I really wish that he would have talked substance. And when we did talk substance, I noticed that, it seems as though he hadn't really learned much about Islam or studied it much. At one point at the end of our discussion, he asked me this question, where or how many Palestinian Christian suicide bombers can you name? And my jaw dropped for a moment because I knew that he was asking this question 10 years ago. There's a YouTube clip where he asks Scott Atran, the anthropologist, where are the Palestinian Christian suicide bombers? And Scott Atran says that there is this organization called the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that is mostly Marxist, mostly Christian, and they do suicide bombing. That was in 2006. I gave him the exact same answer to the exact same question 10 years later, and yet he clings to this idea of, this is practically a science experiment, right? I mean, just to forward the thesis that Muslims are somehow uniquely predisposed to suicide terrorism because of their religion. Again, we can't technically call that racist because Islam is not a race, but it's certainly an Orientalist and bigoted viewpoint, right? That doesn't stand up to even the smallest and minutest amount of scrutiny.
Yeah, and also, and I think this is where, let's widen the aperture here, because the problem is, twofold. One, and this is what I've always said, there's sort of two tracks of this critique. I think generally it's not a good or positive thing to, otherize and essentialize groups of people or be bigoted, right? I know that's super regressive, that's super cucked or whatever. I get all that. That's totally fine. I'm willing to, if that's what that term means, then I embrace it happily. Insofar as I can tell.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Just a quick question to the
please.
critics. Is it regressive to suggest? I mean, because the analogous in America would be that all black people are criminals, right? Or black people commit a disproportionate amount of crime, therefore they're uniquely predisposed to be criminals. The same way that Muslims, majority of the suicide bombers and terrorists are Muslims, therefore Muslims are predisposed. I mean, the really regressive position, I think, the real regressive and reactionary position, which again the critics are not, his followers aren't intelligent enough to understand this, is to paint a broad brush of an entire group rather than to actually be able to isolate, the criminals and the terrorists and whatnot. But, sorry.
And even no problem. And I think that actually that brings me to my second point, and this is where it's also important. I mean, it's important on this, human and civic rights level, but it's also important on the level of people who are serious about understanding terrorism and serious about understanding security threats. So you need to get into the type of detail and distinction that allows you to understand, as an example, a group like Hamas that does engage in terrorism, but also is also a political organization, is also an organization that from a realist perspective you can do business with, to distinguish from the Iranians that have, horrible domestic human rights, that have definitely funded terrorist groups, but clearly have, again, a very realist orientation in foreign policy, and a version of Islamist politics that has, I would say, legitimate politics in it, right? As distinct from a group like ISIS, which really does represent this sort of genocidal, apocalyptic strain. So even right there, you're already getting in and you're making these distinctions. What happens with Sam Harris, and as you would say more disturbingly, the followers and the cult that's kind of forming around him, is this profound commitment to not have any of the serious conversations under the umbrella that the only serious track you can take is to not be historically informed, not to know about policy, and not to have analytic rigor. And I think you would say that this is a broader collapse of kind of what public intellectual work is.
Yeah, I mean, Islam is one of those topics where you can remain completely ignorant and, wedded to ignorance and naivete, and yet still command a public platform and have tons of attention. It's as though no amount of study is required
Right.
of Islam, of the Middle East, of the Muslim world, because it's in the news every single
It may hurt you,
So he,
in fact.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, look, in terms of his followers, though, I received many thoughtful emails that I hope to respond to, that were substantive, that were nuanced, that were thoughtful. On Twitter, though, I guess it's the medium that just brings out the worst in people. And so, people making fun of my voice, and people,
Right.
followers of his just doing all kinds of things. And I really feel bad for them. It's almost like, how can you be so offended that someone challenged this thinker that you admire? I understand that you like him, that you admire him, but yet if you are a free thinker and if you're into free inquiry, that's something that you should welcome. This goes back to Socrates, of all people. No one is above criticism.
Well, Socrates
No
was a
above
regressive,
debate.
though, to be fair, Omer.
Yeah, of course. Because do you think Socrates would have his critics read their critical articles to him?
Well, no,
I mean,
which is why he was a regressive.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but I just feel bad for them, because it's like, there's so many thinkers out there, so many brilliant minds, so many books that you should read and, engage in this quest of knowledge and truth, and not to just get so offended and emotionally respond this way when your leader, when this thinker is criticized. It really reminds me, I've said this before, it reminds me of Muslims and Christians that I've debated with. When you criticize the prophet, when you criticize the religion, they just have this knee-jerk reaction, and all of a sudden, they descend into name-calling. You're dishonest, you're unethical, you're a liar, all these things. I don't take it seriously, really, because at that point they've already conceded that they can't engage in a substantive conversation.
Right.
But it's really frightening. It's really frightening that how these cults form in really unsuspecting places.
Absolutely. So, and the reason, again, that this matters is because there are all of these important issues that do sort of circle around these questions, whether it's, Muslim civil rights in America and Europe, whether it's, what is the balance between national identity and multiculturalism? What is a strategy for dealing with terrorism? I mean, there are so many important questions that are here that, again, having this one-dimensional, monochromatic, stupid conversation about it does not help. From your perspective, what is the project of sort of not just Muslim, but also just sort of more general intellectual leadership, but also specifically Muslim as well, I guess both and, that you think is needed in order to deal with some of the challenges that these conversations bring up?
Yeah, I think that a serious study and serious debates about these issues, the most contentious, controversial issues, we should be having them, but reducing it to this kind of whining about so-and-so misrepresented me and quoted me out of context, and it's just really playground level. Let's have a serious debate about Islamism. Let's have a serious debate about foreign policy. Let's have a serious debate about how we want the world to look like. That's really the fundamental question, right? That intellectuals should be asking. What kind of world do we want to live in? And the thesis I was trying to advance with Sam Harris before, he kept cutting me off and saying, let's go back to the text, was that I want to see a world with, vis-a-vis Islam specifically, where the leftist and progressive opposition is empowered in all of these Muslim countries, because it does exist.
Right.
Women, intellectuals, liberals, scientists who have often taken to the streets for democracy, but have been suppressed by dictators that we've supported, or because of terrorist organizations.
Does our drone policy in Pakistan help Asma Jahangir and her work against corruption and human rights? I mean, that's a specific question for Sam Harris, and I frankly doubt he even knows who Asma Jahangir is.
Yeah, I think Michael Flynn, who was Defense Intelligence Agency or someone senior in the Pentagon, did say that. And in fact, even Stanley McChrystal said that it's counterproductive, the drone policy. But the point I'm getting at is that I'm not into this, let's pick individual voices out of the Muslim world who are brown-skinned, people like Majid Nawaz or Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and tell them to lecture 1.6 billion people about how they should live their life and how they should reform. What I want to do is create movements in these countries to advance a progressive and liberal vision. Because when a progressive, that requires democracy, because when there is democracy in these places and you have progressives and liberals who come to power, the cultural change that they'll implement will be permanent, right? If we're talking about changing culture, if we're talking about changing attitudes, that's a long-term project, and individuals that we just pluck out and we hold up as tokens are not the people who are going to do that, right? I'm not a fan of prophets, whether that prophet's name is Majid Nawaz, whether that prophet's name is Jesus Christ, you know. And so I want to talk about creating movements, and in general, like that's going to be a longer-term project. It's going to require serious intellectual study and support. It's not this sort of game that we've been playing as of late with, you know, let's just talk about isolated verses, isolated from the wider political and social and economic context.
Yeah, the last two kind of fragments I want to touch on before we wrap up is, I mean, what always occurs to me in these conversations is that, you know, religious text from thousands of years ago that has been translated and moved across the globe, that has endless sort of two main strains and then many subvariants within that. That text and that tradition, you just need to read a couple of quotes and you're good. You understand it. But of course, a kind of, you know, pop atheism book from Sam Harris that's written for a kind of general high school and college audience is apparently completely impossible to understand unless you have like the magic Sam Harris decoder ring. And as a final thought, would you like to share your Onion headline that you told me about, that your Onion headline that you felt sort of summarized this whole conversation?
Yeah, I mean, every single time Sam Harris talks about Islam, I'm just like, the Onion headline that should be displayed is, rich white guy in the Bay Area has an opinion about Islam, all caps. Right? I think that, like, that really captures it. I mean, and I just want the point.
Yeah, please.
The point that you made about polls and isolated verses. You know, you're right. We would never study America or study India just by looking at what the polls say. You know, what polls of Indians say. I just got back from the Middle East. I was in Israel, I was in the Emirates, and I was in Turkey, three very different societies.
Right.
And I was just thinking, like, if I tried to understand these societies only by looking at polls, or if I tried to understand Palestinian Muslims or Turkish Muslims by reading the Quran, I would come to absurd, illogical, inaccurate, just flat-out wrong conclusions. And I would think I was an expert, right? This is one of the problems of the world, is that all the intelligent people are so unsure about their conclusions, and all the fools are so sure that they're experts.
Right.
And this is something that we need to combat, I think, and that's going to take complexity and nuance, and we need more history-rich and more informed opinions about these contentious issues.
And as a final point, you know, you're exactly right. And that does not, you know, the other problem that comes up in this conversation, and I think it might just be due to like a collapse in like humanities education or social science education, is that it does not mean that you condone anything. I want to have as sophisticated and rich an understanding of why people support Donald Trump as possible, including people who are supporting him for what I would deem to be very valid but misdirected reasons, right? I want to know in detail and in full kind of view what is driving behavior, even of things that I fundamentally don't condone or support. And I've had conversations, you know, whether on Twitter or other mediums with this sort of group of people and Harris followers and people in that vein, and they will completely equate like an explanation of, you know, earlier Ryan Grimm said one of the reasons the Taliban or groups like that can, grow in support is because they're perceived of as pious and therefore anti-corrupt. That's not obviously a supportive statement of the Taliban. That's a reality. But people will say, oh, my God, I can't believe you're saying the Taliban isn't corrupt, or I can't believe you're saying, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood delivers social services and therefore they deserve to be empowered. Those are value-neutral, descriptive statements that give context. And again, I don't know the line between disingenuous or just simply inability to kind of comprehend these things, but it shows a complete lack of what you're talking about we need.
Yeah, I mean, certain groups of people, you know, you get this stream of information, and you're able to deal with complexity and to form theories and to readjust your analysis of the world as more information comes in. And yet, then there are other groups of people who they can't deal with complexity. They have to cling to their conclusions ideologically, right? Islam is the problem. Muslims are deranged. let's all focus on the text. Here's what the polls say. So you have someone like Sam Harris repeating his lines 10 years later to me, and that is a fault in our public discourse.
Right. Well, Omer Aziz, I appreciate immensely your role in the public discourse and talking with you. And I'll just say up front, taken out of context, unfair, completely misrepresent. We'll see you on Twitter, everybody. And I'll talk with you soon, Omer. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks
Okay.
for having me.
My pleasure.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder, and this is an Ann Coulter doll.
You should not be immigrating here. Stay in your country and hate us.
For smart progressive talk and a little bit of this and even a little bit of that.
Mission accomplished.
Subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and like us on Facebook to get some of our best video clips.